The date is the 15th of November, 1946. But instead of declaring independence, the Philippine Commonwealth votes to petition Congress for statehood. The news shocks Washington. Manila has 100 million reasons why this makes sense. The United States has 100 million reasons why this terrifies them. Because in this alternate timeline, the Philippines does not become a sovereign nation. It becomes the states of Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao, 3 new stars on the American flag. 50 senators instead of 48. The entire balance of power in American democracy shifts west across the Pacific, and everything changes. The civil rights movement happens differently. The Cold War plays out on different terms. Vietnam never happens the way we know it. And today, in 2026, over 130 million American citizens speak Tagalog as their first language. This is not our history, but it could have been. This is the story of what happens when the Philippines chooses a different path. The point of divergence begins in 1945. World War II has just ended. The Philippines has been devastated. Manila is the second most destroyed city in the world after Warsaw. Over 1 million Filipinos are dead. The economy is shattered. Infrastructure is ruins. And the promise of independence, scheduled for the 4th of July 1946, suddenly looks terrifying rather than liberating. In our timeline, independence happened on schedule despite these conditions. But what if the Philippine elite, looking at the devastation, made a different calculation? What if Manuel Roxas and the Ilustrado class decided that joining the United States offered better prospects than going it alone? The historical precedent exists. There was a real Philippine statehood movement. The Federalist Party advocated for it in the early 1900s. Various politicians proposed it throughout the 20th century. In 1981, a candidate actually ran for president on a platform of U.S. annexation. The idea was never mainstream, but it was never completely absent either. In this alternate timeline, the statehood movement succeeds where independence movements fail. The mechanics of how this happens matter. The United States Congress would never accept a single state of the Philippines. The population in 1946 is roughly 19 million people. That would make it the largest state by far, bigger than New York and California combined. It would fundamentally alter the balance of power in both the House of Representatives and the Senate. No American politician would accept that. So the compromise becomes division. The Philippines enters the Union as 3 states: the state of Luzon, containing Manila and the Northern Islands, the state of Visayas, containing the Central Islands, and the state of Mindanao, containing the Southern Islands and Palawan. Each state gets 2 senators. Each gets representation in the House proportional to population. Together, they become a political bloc more powerful than any region except perhaps the entire South. And American politics is never the same. The immediate consequences are economic. Under the statehood deal, federal funding flows to the Philippine states at the same level as mainland states. Social Security, Medicare, once it is created. Federal highway funding, disaster relief, agricultural subsidies, education grants. All the programs that mainland Americans take for granted suddenly apply to Manila, Cebu, and Davao. The effect is transformative. Infrastructure rebuilding happens at American speed with American money. The highway system that in our timeline took decades to build materializes in 10 years. Ports are modernized. Airports are constructed. Telecommunications systems are installed. By 1960, the Philippine states have infrastructure that rivals California. The economic gap that defines our timeline never opens. Instead of being a developing nation, the Philippines develops as America develops. The gap is cultural and linguistic, not economic. The political consequences shake American democracy to its core. The Philippine states send 6 senators to Washington starting in 1947. They send approximately 30 representatives to the House. That is enough to swing any close vote. And Philippine politicians quickly learn to leverage that power. They form alliances with Southern Democrats on some issues and Northern Republicans on others. They become kingmakers in presidential elections. No candidate can win without carrying at least one of the 3 Philippine states. Campaign strategists study Tagalog and hire consultants who understand barangay politics. American politics becomes Pacific-facing in ways it never was in our timeline, and the Philippine politicians who master this game become some of the most powerful figures in American political history. Names like Claro Recto and Ferdinand Marcos become as recognizable to Americans as Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon. The civil rights movement plays out differently because the Philippine states complicate the racial dynamics of mid-century America. In our timeline, civil rights was largely framed as black versus white. In this timeline, you have 19 million brown-skinned Catholic Americans who are legally white under American racial classification, but socially something else entirely. The Philippine states oppose segregation because segregating Filipinos would be economic and political suicide. But they also have complicated relationships with Black Americans and indigenous peoples. Some Filipino-American politicians become allies of the civil rights movement. Others play politics and side with whoever offers them the most power. The movement still succeeds. But it succeeds through a more complex coalition that includes Asian, American, Latino, Black, and progressive white voters. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 looks different because Philippine-American senators help write it, and the long-term trajectory of American racial politics shifts in subtle but important ways. The Vietnam War never happens. This is perhaps the most significant divergence. In our timeline, American involvement in Southeast Asia was driven partly by the domino theory and partly by a lack of regional expertise. In this timeline, America has 3 states in Southeast Asia. The Philippines is not a vulnerable domino. It is American territory. The strategic calculus changes completely. When communist insurgencies threaten neighboring countries, America responds not with troops, but with economic development programs modeled on what worked in the Philippine states. The Marshall Plan for Southeast Asia happens a decade earlier than in our timeline. Countries like South Vietnam and Thailand receive massive American investment and support without the military occupation. Some of these interventions succeed, some fail. But the catastrophic American military involvement that defined our timeline does not happen because American policymakers are getting better information from Philippine-American officials who actually understand the region. The cultural exchange between the Philippines and the mainland United States transforms both. Tagalog becomes the second most spoken language in America by 1970. Filipino cuisine enters the American mainstream decades before it did in our timeline. Adobo and lumpia are as American as tacos and pizza. In reverse, American consumer culture penetrates the Philippine states more thoroughly than in our timeline. Basketball becomes even more dominant than it already is. American media, American brands, American attitudes shape Philippine culture in ways that create something new. Neither fully Filipino nor fully American, but a hybrid that defines itself as both. The children of this generation grow up watching American television in Tagalog. They play American sports and listen to American music while maintaining Filipino family structures and social networks. By the 1980s, this hybrid Filipino-American culture starts influencing the mainland. Asian American identity becomes more visible and more complex because there are tens of millions of Filipino Americans with full political rights demanding recognition. The economic development of the Philippine states creates a new regional power center that rivals California. Manila becomes one of the great American cities. In our timeline, Manila struggles with poverty and overpopulation. In this timeline, federal investment and private capital transform it into a modern metropolis. By 1980, Manila has a population of 12 million and a skyline that competes with New York. It becomes the financial hub of the Pacific. Banks, corporations, and trading companies that want to do business in Asia establish headquarters there because it gives them a foothold in American territory with access to Asian markets. The Port of Manila handles more cargo than Los Angeles. The Manila Stock Exchange rivals Wall Street for Pacific trade. And the wealth this generates does not just concentrate in Manila. It spreads through Cebu, Davao, and smaller cities that become manufacturing and service centers. The Philippine states are not rich in the way that California is rich, but they are solidly middle class in ways that developing nations never achieve. The environmental and social problems that plague our timeline manifest differently. Corruption does not disappear just because the Philippines becomes American, but it changes form. American federal oversight and media attention make old-style patronage politics harder to sustain. Politicians still hand out favors and build dynasties, but they have to do it within American legal frameworks that impose some accountability. Environmental degradation still happens, forests are still cut down, fisheries are still depleted. But federal environmental regulations that apply to all states also apply to Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. The worst excesses are prevented not through enlightened leadership, but through bureaucratic rules that nobody can ignore. The result is environmental damage, but not environmental catastrophe. The problems are manageable rather than existential, and when disasters do happen, federal disaster relief ensures that communities can recover in ways that would be impossible in a developing nation. The question of Mindanao creates unique complications in this timeline. In our history, Mindanao struggles with Muslim separatist movements and chronic violence. In this timeline, Mindanao is an American state. That changes everything. The Moro separatist movements do not want independence from the Philippines. They want independence from America. That frames the conflict differently. American presidents cannot simply ignore what happens in an American state. Federal troops deploy to suppress violence. But federal money also flows to address grievances, land reform, development programs, protections for Muslim cultural practices, and Sharia law in local courts. The violence never completely stops, but it is contained through a combination of force and accommodation that looks more like how America handled labor conflicts than how it handled foreign insurgencies. By the 1990s, Mindanao has negotiated a unique status within the American federal system that gives Muslim areas significant autonomy while remaining part of the state. The Cold War strategy of the United States changes fundamentally. Instead of relying on unstable allies and military dictatorships across Asia, America has an actual territorial presence. Clark Air Base and Subic Bay Naval Base are not leased facilities on foreign soil. They are American bases on American territory. That permanence allows for much larger investments. These bases become among the most important American military installations in the world. During the Korean War, they serve as the logistical backbone. During tensions with China, they serve as the forward position. The strategic value to American military planners cannot be overstated. And because they are on American soil, there are no negotiations about lease renewals or host nation politics. The bases are simply there, permanent, unassailable. That stability allows American Pacific strategy to develop coherence that it lacked in our timeline when every base existed on sufferance of an unpredictable foreign government. The immigrant experience is completely different. In our timeline, Filipino immigration to the United States is limited by quotas and creates a diaspora separated from the homeland. In this timeline, there is no immigration because Filipinos are already Americans. They can move to California or New York as easily as someone from Texas moves to Florida, and many do. By 1970, there are 10 million Filipino-Americans living on the mainland. They cluster in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle, and New York. They create ethnic enclaves that function like Little Italy or Chinatown, but bigger and more politically powerful. These communities send representatives to Congress. They build businesses. They establish cultural institutions. And they maintain connections to the Philippine states while integrating into mainland American life. The result is a truly Pacific America, where Asian and Pacific Islander identity is not marginal, but central to what it means to be American. The international implications are profound. In this timeline, America is not just militarily present in Asia, it is territorially present. That changes how every Asian nation relates to the United States. Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan see America as a Pacific power in ways that feel more permanent and less threatening than military alliances. China views American presence as a fundamental challenge to regional dominance that cannot be negotiated away because it is not based on alliances but on sovereignty. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations develops differently because one of the founding members of ASEAN in our timeline is now 3 American states. The regionalism that defines our timeline never fully develops. Instead, Southeast Asian countries orient themselves either toward or against American influence in ways that create different alliance patterns and different conflicts. The entire geopolitical landscape of the Pacific shifts because America is not just projecting power, it is present. Language politics become a defining American debate. The Philippine states are officially bilingual, conducting government business in both English and Tagalog. That creates pressure for other states with large Spanish-speaking populations to demand similar recognition. By the 1970s, America is having national conversations about whether to become officially multilingual. Some states resist, others embrace it. The compromise is that English remains the national language, but states can designate additional official languages. California adds Spanish, Hawaii adds Hawaiian and Japanese, New Mexico adds Spanish and Navajo. The linguistic map of America becomes more complex. And this complexity, driven initially by the addition of the Philippine states, creates an America that looks more like Europe than the monolingual nation of our timeline. Translation services become standard in federal agencies. Bilingual education becomes policy rather than controversy. The entire character of American identity shifts toward embracing diversity rather than demanding assimilation. The technology sector develops differently because the Philippine states become a major source of engineering talent and manufacturing capacity. In our timeline, Silicon Valley dominates American tech. In this timeline, Manila Tech Park rivals it. The University of the Philippines becomes one of the great American universities, producing engineers and computer scientists who drive the digital revolution. When semiconductors and electronics manufacturing moved to Asia in the 1980s, much of it goes to the Philippine states rather than to Taiwan or South Korea. American companies build factories in Luzon and Mindanao because they can maintain American legal protections and intellectual property rights while benefiting from lower labor costs. The result is that America maintains more manufacturing capacity through the late 20th century than it did in our timeline. The hollowing out of American industry still happens. But it happens more slowly and less completely because some of that industry relocates to American territory in the Pacific rather than to foreign countries. The question that haunts this timeline is whether the Philippine states are genuinely equal or perpetually second class. American racism does not disappear just because Filipinos have citizenship. In the 1950s and 1960s, Filipino-Americans faced discrimination on the mainland: housing discrimination, employment discrimination, social exclusion. The civil rights movement addresses some of this. Federal legislation prohibits the worst practices, but cultural attitudes change slowly. Filipinos are stereotyped as service workers and nurses and laborers, regardless of actual occupation. The assumption persists among many mainland Americans that the Philippine states are not really American, not fully part of the Union, somehow different. Filipino-American politicians fight this constantly. They demand equal treatment. They use their political power to punish discrimination. And slowly, over decades, the perception shifts. By 2000, Filipino-Americans have been senators, governors, cabinet secretaries, and Supreme Court justices. The barriers have not disappeared, but they have weakened enough that Filipino-American identity is recognized as authentically American. The economic inequality between the Philippine states and the mainland persists despite federal investment. In 2020, median household income in Luzon is 70% of the national average. In Mindanao, it is 60%. These gaps exist in our timeline between rich states like Connecticut and poor states like Mississippi. But they feel different when the poor states are populated by brown-skinned Catholics speaking Tagalog. Critics argue that the federal system perpetuates colonial relationships under a different name. Supporters point to infrastructure, healthcare, and education levels that far exceed what the Philippines achieved as an independent nation in our timeline. Both are right. The Philippine states are better off economically than independent Philippines, but they are still poorer than most mainland states. And that inequality carries echoes of the colonial past that statehood was supposed to erase. The environmental gains are real but uneven. Federal environmental laws prevent the worst industrial pollution. The Clean Water Act and Clean Air Act apply to Manila as they do to Los Angeles. That saves the Philippine states from the environmental catastrophes that plague developing nations in our timeline. But enforcement is often lax. Companies dump waste in rivers and get fined amounts that are tiny compared to profits. Forests are logged beyond sustainable levels because federal rangers are understaffed and local politicians are bought off. The environmental movement that emerges in the 1970s includes Filipino-American activists who fight for their communities. They win some battles, they lose others. By 2020, the Philippine states have better air and water quality than independent Philippines in our timeline, but they still lag behind mainland standards. The gap reflects both economic reality and political power. Richer states can afford environmental protection. Poorer states often sacrifice it for jobs and growth. The cultural influence flows both directions. Filipino-Americans reshape American cuisine, music, fashion, and art. Mainstream American culture absorbs these influences until they become part of the background. But American culture also transforms the Philippines in ways that erase some indigenous traditions. By 2020, young Filipino-Americans in Manila speak English more fluently than Tagalog. Traditional dress is something worn for festivals, not daily life. Extended family structures weaken as nuclear families become the norm. The cultural price of Americanization is loss of distinctiveness. What emerges is neither traditional Filipino culture nor mainstream American culture, but something hybrid. Critics call it cultural imperialism. Defenders call it evolution. Both descriptions capture part of the truth. The alternative history raises uncomfortable questions about independence and self-determination. In our timeline, the Philippines is a sovereign nation. It makes its own decisions, however imperfectly. It has its own foreign policy, its own currency, its own identity. In this timeline, the Philippine states give up sovereignty for security and prosperity. They gain higher incomes and better infrastructure. They lose the ability to chart their own course. Filipino-American politicians have influence in Washington, but Washington makes the final decisions. When America goes to war, Filipino-Americans fight whether they agree or not. When federal policy hurts the Philippine states, they can protest, but they cannot refuse. The trade-off is real. Economic security for political autonomy. The question has no easy answer. Some Filipino-Americans in this timeline believe statehood was the right choice. Others regret what was lost. The debate never ends. The relationship with other Asian nations is complex. In our timeline, the Philippines participates in ASEAN as an equal. In this timeline, the Philippine states are American territory. That creates resentment among neighbors who see them as having chosen colonialism over solidarity. Trade relationships are mediated through American policy rather than negotiated directly. Cultural exchanges happen, but they are always colored by the political reality that the Philippines is now America. Some Filipinos in neighboring countries view Filipino-Americans as having sold out. Others see them as having made a pragmatic choice. The tension never fully resolves, and it shapes how the Pacific region develops through the 20th and 21st centuries. The military service of Filipino-Americans becomes a point of pride and controversy. In every American war from Korea onward, Filipino-Americans serve and die in disproportionate numbers. The tradition of military service is strong in the Philippine states. Economic opportunity is limited, and the military offers stable employment with benefits. By 2020, 15% of the United States military is Filipino-American, despite Filipino-Americans being only 13% of the total population. That service earns respect. But it also raises questions about whether the Philippine states are providing cannon fodder for American wars. The debate mirrors similar debates about African-American military service. The answers are complicated and deeply personal. Looking at this alternate history in 2026, the conclusion is ambiguous. The Philippine states have higher average incomes than independent Philippines in our timeline. They have better healthcare, better education, better infrastructure. Life expectancy is 10 years longer. Child mortality is dramatically lower. By every material measure, Filipino-Americans are better off. But they live in a country where they are a minority with limited ability to shape national policy on issues that do not directly affect them. They have traded national sovereignty for individual prosperity. Whether that trade was worth it depends entirely on what you value: economic security or political self-determination, inclusion in a global superpower or independence as a middle power. Neither choice is obviously superior. Both have costs, both have benefits. And the people who live with those consequences have spent 80 years debating which path was right. The debate continues because there is no definitive answer. There is only the reality of choices made and roads not taken.